The Middle Ages didn't begin with a sword. They began with a diagnosis. History has 6 ages, and you are trapped in the 6th. Old, brittle, waiting for judgment. Not progress, not discovery. A countdown. So here's the big question that will govern everything we do. When a society becomes convinced the future is already cancelled, who profits from that fear? And who pays to keep order feeling inevitable? Chronicles love kings, but sermons, city punishments, and scribbles in book margins keep receipts. Viewer discretion advised. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Step into an early medieval town and feel what the calendar cannot show you. A culture that treats decline as physics. Bad harvest? Not policy failure. Proof the world is getting old. War on the horizon? Not strategy. Judgment. Disease in the streets? Not biology. An omen. The metaphor repeats until it hardens into common sense. The world is like an aging man losing strength. That idea converts events into fate. And once fate is in charge, accountability can be dismissed as arrogance. Now look up. You live among the fossils of an empire. Roman aqueducts stride across valleys like petrified rivers. Colossal arenas squat in the city's heart. You don't just admire them, you are physically dwarfed by them. The past stands over you. In that shadow, creativity doesn't look heroic, it looks suspect. If the ancients were giants, your job is not to build taller. Your job is to climb what already exists and call it wisdom. That is why medieval intellectual life often treats truth as inheritance, not invention. Truth was revealed by scripture, by revered authorities, by the giants. The safest way to speak is to quote. The safest way to think is to comment. The age gives itself a motto. We are dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. Humble on the surface, lethal in practice. Because when truth is always located in the past, the present can be ruled by controlling access to that past. Who gets to interpret the giants? Who decides which quotations count, which books are copied, which are condemned, which are declared heresy? Control the gatekeepers, priests, scholars, courts, and you don't need to promise a future. You only need to manage permission. Permission is cheaper than prosperity. This mindset is the machinery that makes the rest of the Middle Ages work. Images dominate because images move faster than arguments. Public shame becomes a weapon because it is low cost and contagious. Rumor becomes authority because print is rare. And truth belongs to whoever your village trusts. Violence becomes a market because power can be hired, traded, and denied. So don't start with knights and castles. Start with the mindset that made them logical. A society trained to believe the end is already written. Because the Middle Ages, what keeps returning, was never just a time period. It was a way of governing people who have stopped asking, what can we build next? And started asking, how do we survive the end? When Rome fell in the West, it didn't just collapse as a government, it collapsed as a reference point. A civilization that had trained people to expect roads, aqueducts, taxes, courts, armies, suddenly broke apart into smaller powers that could not maintain the machine they inherited. And the first thing that dies when the machine breaks is not comfort, it's confidence. That's why early medieval Europe is saturated with a specific mood, doom that feels rational, not melodrama, diagnosis. People looked around and thought, we are not merely having a bad decade, we are living in the final stage of a world that is literally wearing out. One text that was widely read later captures the mindset with unnerving clarity. In the 3rd century, a Christian writer describes failing crops and scarce rain not as a technical problem, but as a symptom. The world is like an old man losing strength. Notice what that does. It turns the environment into a moral barometer. It turns hardship into evidence. It turns management into theology. And once hardship becomes evidence, the most profitable thing in a society is not solutions, it's interpretation. Because interpretation lets you assign blame without fixing anything. A harvest fails? You don't need irrigation policy, you need repentance. A war comes? You don't need logistics, you need obedience. A disease spreads? You don't need public health, you need someone to confess, someone to be punished, someone to carry the guilt so everyone else can feel clean. This is not ignorance, it's political psychology. A community facing instability will pay, emotionally and materially, for narratives that make instability feel legible. People will accept brutal discipline if they believe it buys cosmic safety. They will tolerate inequality if they believe inequality is part of the order of things. And the people who thrive in that marketplace are the ones who can claim the right to explain what the crisis means. Now look at the more physical side of this collapse. Medieval people did not live in a vacuum. They lived in the ruins of intellectual and infrastructural giants. They walked past stonework they couldn't easily repair. They saw monumental engineering without having the tax base, the specialized labor, or the administrative continuity to reproduce it on demand. That matters because a crumbling aqueduct is not only a broken pipeline, it is a daily propaganda poster for the superiority of the dead. The past becomes a weapon when it's visible. It tells you, wordlessly, your ancestors were greater. Your life is smaller. Your ambitions are an illusion. And if you're the ruling class in a fragile world, this is useful. Because a population trained to believe we are declining is easier to govern than a population trained to ask who is responsible. Decline is a fog that hides fingerprints. It's the perfect alibi. You can always say, the world is old, times are hard, nothing can be done, so obey. This is where the modern parallel in the competitor script actually matters. Not because today is literally medieval, but because the emotional mechanics rhyme. We do the same thing, rose tint the past, panic about the future. You can see it in the language. Late stage capitalism. Everything is broken. We're cooked. You can see it in the generational morality play. The last era had cheap houses, livable wages, and a stable ladder. The current era has debt, precarious work, expensive children, and invisible toxins in the food chain. Whether every detail is universally true doesn't even matter. The structure is the point. People are telling themselves a story of decline, because decline makes the anxiety feel coherent. But there's a trap hiding in that coherence. When you internalize the idea that the system is naturally decaying, you stop demanding a redesign. You start bargaining for a softer landing. You start treating injustice as weather, unfortunate but normal. This is how civilizations drift from citizenship into spectatorship. You don't fight for a future you don't believe in. You don't invest in a tomorrow you think has already been cancelled. And here is the ugliest part. Decline narratives are not equally distributed. Some people experience decline as an aesthetic. Ruins, nostalgia, melancholy. Others experience it as a budget line item. Hunger, conscription, eviction, scapegoating, public punishment. The ledger of collapse always has winners, because collapse is not a single event. It is a long process of reassigning costs downward. Who gets first access to scarce grain? Who gets legal protection when violence rises? Who can buy guards, bribe officials, purchase exemptions, flee to safer territory, or simply redefine the crisis as God's will, so nobody asks about mismanagement? In every era, the answer is the same: those closest to authority. Decline doesn't eliminate hierarchy, it hardens it. So, if you want to understand what comes next, don't ask whether medieval people were pessimistic. Ask how pessimism becomes policy. Ask how the world is old turns into you must accept your place. Ask how a society can turn fear into routine compliance. Because within a few centuries, that fear will be spoken out loud from pulpits as a direct political message. Not only are times bad, the apocalypse is beginning, and the enemy at your gates is proof. And once a leader convinces you that catastrophe is sacred, they can demand anything. So here's the open loop. When disaster is framed as judgment, who gets to define the sin, and who gets chosen to pay for it? In the year 1014, an archbishop stood before an exhausted people and did what every durable regime does in a crisis. He gave suffering a meaning that made obedience feel holy. Wulfstan, Archbishop of York, preached what later readers would call Sermo Lupi ad Anglos, the Sermon of the Wolf to the English. The title alone is a warning label. This is not a calm lecture. It's an alarm, a moral indictment, a map of disaster where every road leads to one conclusion: we deserve what is happening to us. That sermon matters because it shows you the Middle Ages in its most efficient form. Not castles, not knights, not mud. A rhetoric machine that converts instability into discipline. Wulfstan is speaking in a world where Scandinavian raids and political fragmentation have made life feel precarious. But listen to the mechanism. He does not present violence as a policy problem. He presents it as a symptom of collective rot. He frames external threat as proof that the apocalypse is near, or at least that divine punishment is active. In other words, the real enemy isn't only the Vikings. It's your neighbors. It's you. If that sounds cruel, it's because it is. The sermon turns social pain into an ethical courtroom, and the population becomes the defendant. Once that move is made, the state, if it can still be called a state, no longer needs to explain why defenses failed or why elites fought each other while villages burned. The people are told that asking who mismanaged this is missing the point. The point is repentance. This is how you govern a society that thinks it is in the last age. You don't sell hope. You sell guilt management. Because guilt is productive. Guilt makes people police themselves. It makes them accept sacrifices that would otherwise look like exploitation. It makes them interpret inequality as moral hierarchy. The powerful are powerful because God allowed it. The suffering suffer because God is warning them. And once suffering is moralized, the door opens to a particular kind of politics, one that does not need improvement to survive. It only needs ritual, ritualized shame, ritualized punishment, ritualized purification of the community. This is where the aesthetic of doom becomes a tool of power. The competitor script is right about one thing. Medieval decline wasn't just a feeling. It had consequences. If you believe the world is decaying toward judgment, then novelty looks dangerous. Innovation looks like hubris. Changing the system feels like arguing with God. So the safest mental posture is not creativity, but submission disguised as wisdom. Repeat the authorities, honor tradition, punish deviance. Now look at how this changes the relationship between ruler and ruled. The modern story we tell ourselves is that people obey because they are forced. That's half true. The deeper truth is that people obey because obedience is offered as a bargain. Obey, and the chaos will be contained. Obey, and the community will be protected. Obey, and the wrath will pass over your house. That bargain is older than feudalism. It is the emotional core of feudalism, and it creates a chain of complicity. The Lord demands rents and labor. In exchange, the Lord promises protection. But protection in a crumbling world is never evenly distributed. The powerful do not simply protect. They decide who counts as protectable. So when raids intensify, when famine hits, when plague whispers on the horizon, the question everyone should be asking is not, are we being punished? It's, who is being protected and at what price? Because apocalypse talk performs a second trick. It turns violence into inevitability. If God is judging, then suffering is not an injustice, it's a message. If suffering is a message, then the people who administer suffering can style themselves as interpreters of God, rather than perpetrators of harm, even when the harm is brutal, even when the harm is political. This is where we need to be blunt. End times thinking is not only theology, it is a technology for dissolving responsibility. It makes disaster feel natural. It makes exploitation feel corrective. And it makes dissent look like spiritual sabotage. If you want to see why this rhetoric is so persistent, ask what it offers in exchange. It offers a kind of psychological anesthesia. It tells you the terror has a pattern, that you are not helpless. You can do something. Confess, obey, punish, purify. It replaces uncertainty with a script. And people cling to scripts when reality is unlivable. But scripts always have authors. Wulfstan's sermon is a snapshot of an author at work. It is governance by condemnation. And once this style of governance becomes normal, it doesn't stay inside churches. It leaks into law. It leaks into punishment. It leaks into the everyday culture of watching and judging, where the community becomes the court and reputation becomes the battlefield. We are going there next, because the Middle Ages didn't only fear collapse. They built systems that turned fear into public discipline. So, here's the plot turn. If catastrophe can be framed as proof of sin, then the next step is obvious. Someone has to be identified as the sin. And once a society accepts that, the question stops being, is the accusation true? The question becomes, will the accusation restore order? Walk through Rome in the early Middle Ages, and you feel a violence that doesn't bleed. It's scale. You are a person trying to survive inside the skeleton of something you cannot rebuild. Massive arches, broken marble, aqueducts that once carried water with the quiet certainty of empire, an arena so large it looks like a mountain someone hollowed out for entertainment. You don't need a sermon to be taught humility here. The stones preach on their own, and the sermon they preach is simple. You are late. You arrived after greatness. You are living on the leftovers of a civilization that could do things you can barely maintain. The past is not behind you. It is above you. It looms. This matters because despair is not only emotional. Despair is architectural. When the built environment tells you every day that your ancestors were giants, your imagination shrinks to match the ceiling. You stop asking, what could we build? And start asking, what can we salvage? That shift is not a poetic tragedy. It is a political advantage for anyone who wants society stable, obedient, and low risk. Because salvage culture produces a particular kind of citizen, cautious, reverent, dependent on gatekeepers. Here's the economic reality under the romance. Rome's infrastructure was not a miracle of genius. It was a miracle of administration, taxation, standardized labor, supply chains, engineers who could travel, records that could be audited, and a state with enough authority to compel maintenance across distances. When that administrative web fractures, the stones don't stop being impressive, but they stop being reproducible. Repair becomes expensive, coordination becomes fragile, and projects that require long-term stability become fantasies. So, the ruins are not only monuments, they are daily evidence of what happens when the machine that funds them dies. And when evidence of decline becomes unavoidable, people will build explanations that protect them from the terror of randomness. That's where the last age mindset slides perfectly into place. If you are surrounded by broken grandeur, it is psychologically easier to believe the world is naturally aging than to believe your society has been mismanaged into poverty and fragmentation. Aging is impersonal. Aging has no culprit. Aging is the cleanest alibi power has ever invented. Now watch how this changes morality. In a world where the past is sacred and the present is smaller, originality becomes suspicious. The safest intellectual move is to kneel to authority. Not necessarily because everyone is terrified of new ideas, but because new ideas are expensive. They require experimentation, failure, investment, and institutions that can protect a thinker while they're wrong. Declining societies do not reward being wrong. They punish it. So the culture shifts from invention to compilation, from creation to commentary, from I will build a new system to I will organize what the giants already said. It looks like humility. It feels like virtue. And it has an overlooked side effect. It centralizes power in the hands of interpreters. If truth lives in the past, then whoever controls the past controls the present. Not the past as a timeline, but the past as a library, as a canon, as a list of acceptable authorities. Which texts are copied? Which survive? Which are taught? Which are labeled dangerous? When a society is anxious, the act of preserving knowledge becomes an act of selecting knowledge, and selection always has politics baked into it. Tradition is never neutral. It is a curated playlist. That's why the medieval world doesn't need to invent propaganda the way modern regimes do. The propaganda is already sitting in the streets. The propaganda is the ruins. The propaganda is the constant, embodied reminder that life used to be bigger, stronger, more coherent. So, your suffering must be natural. Your smallness must be proper. Your obedience must be wise. And once that logic sinks in, it spills into everything: law, art, religion, and punishment. Not because medieval people were uniquely cruel, but because smallness breeds hunger for certainty. When the future feels closed, certainty becomes more valuable than freedom. So now, turn your gaze forward in our story. Because we are doing something eerily similar with the 20th century. We look at moon landings, supersonic passenger jets, huge public works, and we don't only feel admiration, we feel accused. We wonder why we can't do it again. We tell ourselves it's too expensive, too regulated, too complicated, too political. Sometimes those are true constraints. But psychologically, it becomes the same pressure the ruins created. The feeling that the best has already happened, and we are living in the afterglow, managing decay. And here is the danger. Once a population accepts decline as the default, they become willing to trade almost anything for the sensation of order. They will accept harsher discipline, louder moral policing, and cheaper forms of justice. Because expensive justice requires institutions that function, and a society that believes it has a future worth funding. Which brings us to the next mechanism the Middle Ages perfected. If you can't reliably deliver prosperity, you can still deliver spectacle. You can still deliver visible morality. You can still deliver public examples, cheap, performative, contagious, not by building aqueducts, by building shame. So here's the open loop. When a society can no longer afford greatness, what does it build instead? Security, or a stage where someone else is forced to pay for everyone's fear? A civilization that feels smaller than its own ruins develops a strange moral reflex. It starts treating newness like a threat. Not because medieval people were allergic to creativity, because creativity is expensive. It requires time, surplus, institutional protection, and a tolerance for failure. Those are luxuries in a world that believes it is living in the last age, where famine can arrive like weather, war can arrive like fate, and tomorrow is a question mark written in fire. So instead of celebrating invention, the medieval mind learns to worship inheritance. Truth, in this worldview, is not something you manufacture in the present. Truth is something you receive from the past. Scripture, the Church Fathers, Aristotle, Augustine, authorities that are already dead, already canonized, already safe. If the past is sacred, then the present is obligated to interpret, not compete. That's why medieval scholarship often looks like an endless chain of commentary. A thinker doesn't publish a new philosophy. He writes notes on Aristotle. He harmonizes contradictions. He compiles, organizes, and edits. He builds cathedrals of footnotes. And this isn't mere imitation. It's a survival strategy. If you anchor your ideas to accepted giants, you inherit their legitimacy. Then comes the line that sounds like pure humility, but functions like a constitution for control. We are like dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. It's associated with Bernard of Chartres and preserved for us by John of Salisbury. And it becomes a cultural self-portrait. We see father only because we stand on what came before. Beautiful. And yes, partly true. But here is what the phrase can hide. When an anxious society repeats it long enough, the dwarf is not allowed to step off the shoulders. because stepping off means standing alone. Standing alone means risk. And risk, in a culture trained to see disaster as judgment, is not just impractical. It can be framed as immoral. So let's confront the political physics of this. If truth lives in the past, then the most valuable power in the present is the power to manage access to the past. Not knowledge as an abstract ideal, knowledge as a controlled supply. Who gets educated? Who can read Latin? Who can enter a library? Who can afford manuscripts? Who decides what is copied and what is left to rot? Who declares a text orthodox and another dangerous? These are not academic questions. They are sovereignty questions. Because in a commentary culture, the interpreter is king. This is the legal and logistical side of medieval truth. Manuscripts cost money. Copying requires trained labor. Storage requires institutions. Education requires time away from survival work. In other words, the past is not freely available. It is owned, maintained, and distributed. And anything that is distributed can be rationed. Once you see it that way, you can see the quiet bargain medieval societies made with themselves. They may not be able to rebuild Rome's infrastructure, but they can rebuild Rome's authority selectively. They can weaponize tradition. They can say, the giants have spoken, so your suffering must have meaning. The giants have spoken, so your questions must have limits. This is why originality can become suspicious, because originality threatens the rationing system. A new idea doesn't ask permission. A new idea doesn't need the gatekeepers. A new idea can embarrass the old hierarchy by proving that the present is capable of more than survival. So, hierarchies learn to moralize stability. They learn to present obedience as wisdom. They learn to brand curiosity as arrogance. And in the most anxious moments, they learn to treat deviance not as disagreement, but as contamination. Here's where the competitor script's cultural point becomes something darker than pop commentary. When a society's highest virtue is faithfulness to authority, then morality becomes performative. Your role is not to discover truth. Your role is to signal alignment with it. And signaling is a social technology. It builds in-groups, creates heretics, and turns disagreement into danger. That's not medieval exclusive, that's human. But the Middle Ages made it a system. Because when a future feels closed, the present cannot offer people upward mobility through innovation. So it offers people a different kind of reward, status irrogius through conformity, righteousness through repetition, safety through visible belonging. And that brings us to the hinge. Once truth is inherited and rationed, the job of power shifts. Power doesn't need to create prosperity. It needs to manage meaning. It needs to keep the community convinced that the world's pain has a moral explanation, and that the institution offering that explanation deserves obedience. The next step is inevitable. If you can't rebuild the world materially, you can still rebuild it symbolically. You can create a shared visual language that bypasses literacy. You can flood daily life with images that teach fear, belonging, and punishment faster than any book. This is where we pivot from libraries to walls, from manuscripts to stained glass, from scholarship to spectacle, because the medieval world, for most people, was not read, it was seen. So here's the open loop. When truth is controlled by gatekeepers, and most people can't access the written word, what becomes the most powerful weapon? Argument or image? If you want to understand why originality starts to smell dangerous in a declining world, don't begin with philosophy. Begin with risk. Innovation is a bet, and bets require a gambler who can afford to lose. Medieval societies, especially in their more precarious moments, often couldn't. When harvests fail, when war rolls like weather, when disease can erase a town, the margin for error collapses. A culture under stress becomes allergic to experiments because experiments create visible losers. And visible losers attract punishment. In that environment, the safest path is not new. The safest path is authorized. So the system leans toward repetition. Repeat the law, repeat the sermon, repeat the social order. Not because people are uniquely unimaginative, but because the cost of being wrong is too high. Now pivot to the present. The competitor script makes a provocative claim. Our era is beginning to resemble the Middle Ages because we've lost the ability to imagine a new future. Whether you buy the metaphor or not, the mechanism it points to is real, and it has an economic spine. Modern culture is increasingly built like a medieval commentary tradition, not creating new worlds, but expanding the footnotes of old ones. Reboots, remakes, cinematic universes, endless sequels, extended lore. Even when something looks new, it often arrives packaged inside an established brand because brands function like medieval authorities. They are safe to cite. This isn't just laziness, it's financial design. Big budget culture runs on capital that hates uncertainty. A fresh story is a risk. A familiar franchise is collateral. So the market rewards repetition, not because audiences are incapable of loving novelty, but because investors price novelty like danger. When fear drives the funding, art becomes insurance. And insurance always comes with rules. This is the part most people miss. A cancelled future is not only an emotional mood, it can be produced. It can be engineered by incentives. If the system pays you to recycle, then recycling becomes the default imagination. You stop expecting surprise. You stop expecting a break from the loop. You start living inside a cultural manor house where every room is decorated with the same inherited furniture. In modern theory, Mark Fisher wrote about this feeling, the sense that the future has been slowly cancelled, that we keep remixing the late 20th century the way medieval thinkers kept remixing Greece and Rome. Even if you quibble over which exact book phrased it which way, the mood he named is familiar. Cultural time feels stuck. But here's the sharper, more confrontational question. Stuck for whom? Because the cancelled future isn't evenly distributed. For some, it's nostalgia fatigue. Too many sequels, not enough new ideas. For others, it's structural. Wages that don't rise, housing that vanishes behind prices, children that become financially impossible, and a social ladder that feels like a prop. This is where decline narratives become dangerous again. Decline stories can be true in parts, but they also have a political side effect. They train you to treat injustice as climate. You don't organize against climate. You adapt. You endure. You lower your expectations. You privately negotiate with a system you no longer believe can be changed. That psychological shift is not harmless. It creates the perfect citizen for an age of managed stagnation. Someone who complains, but doesn't expect transformation. Someone who is anxious, but resigned. someone who is easier to sell order to, because order is cheaper than prosperity. And here is the Middle Ages rhyme. When the future feels closed, society becomes more interested in legitimacy theatre than in actual reform. People can't demand new infrastructure if they've accepted that greatness is over. But they can demand punishment. They can demand visible morality. They can demand someone be blamed. A closed future makes scapegoats feel necessary. Because scapegoats offer an illusion of control. They say, the system isn't broken. The system is being sabotaged. If we remove the saboteur, order returns. It's the same emotional bargain that Wulfstan's sermon offered. Suffering is not random, it's deserved, and therefore fixable through discipline. And once discipline becomes the currency, culture begins to shift toward what delivers discipline fastest. Not books, not arguments, not slow institutions, images, spectacle, viral rituals of shame. This is the hinge where we move from the future is cancelled to the world becomes visual. In the Middle Ages, most people couldn't read, so power spoke through architecture, paintings, stained glass, plays, processions, and public punishments. In the modern world, we have literacy, but we increasingly live in streams of images that bypass careful reading and hit the nervous system directly. That's not a moral panic. That's a structural change in how authority is performed. And it sets up the next part of our story. When culture turns visual, truth becomes easier to manipulate, fear becomes easier to spread, and justice becomes easier to stage. So here's the open loop. If the future can be cancelled by incentives, and if a society starts living through images, what happens when images become the primary battlefield for legitimacy? In the Middle Ages, power did not need to convince you with footnotes. It needed to show you. Most people, for most of medieval Europe, did not live inside dense texts. They lived inside pictures, performances, and rituals that could be understood instantly. Without literacy, without Latin, without access to libraries. Doctrine on church walls, saints in stained glass. Passion plays in town squares. Processions that turned belief into choreography. The message didn't travel primarily through reading. It traveled through sight, sound, and repetition. That's not an insult to medieval intelligence. It's a description of the medium. And the medium has a political consequence. When a society is primarily visual, authority becomes something you watch. You watch God judging on the wall. You watch sinners punished in the square. You watch the hierarchy march past you. And you learn the lesson your nervous system absorbs faster than any argument. This is real, this is sacred, and you are small. Now place that beside the present. The competitor script calls us a post-literate society, a phrase that can sound like arrogance until you watch how information actually moves. We don't have to become illiterate for the world to become post-literate. We just have to become indifferent to long-form reasoning. We just have to build an economy where attention is the scarce resource and images are the most efficient way to harvest it. Because images compress complexity into emotion. They travel faster than explanation. They bypass skepticism. They trigger belonging, disgust, fear, desire, right now. That is why visual culture is not neutral entertainment. It is political infrastructure. And when visual culture dominates, the central question shifts. It's no longer, is this true? It becomes, does this feel true? In medieval terms, that is how miracles spread, not through peer review, through shared emotional recognition. Everyone saw it, everyone heard it, everyone believes it. In modern terms, that is how virality works. The proof is that the clip exists, the screenshot circulates, the outrage is unanimous, the comments agree, the ratio is brutal. Truth becomes a performance with metrics. Now add the new ingredient the Middle Ages didn't have: synthetic manipulation at scale. The more a society lives through images, the more vulnerable it becomes to whoever can manufacture images that look like reality. You don't need to win an argument. You need to flood the feed. You don't need to persuade. You need to shape the atmosphere. This is what makes the return of the image world so dangerous. Not because people are stupid, but because the nervous system is efficient. We evolved to trust what looks immediate. A face, a voice, a crowd, a symbol. When that immediacy is cheap to fake, the cost of deception collapses. And when the cost of deception collapses, the cost of hatred collapses with it. Because hatred runs on pictures. It runs on simplified villains, exaggerated threats, decontextualized moments, and symbols that feel larger than life. Medieval Europe understood this intuitively. Paint hell vividly enough, and you don't need a theology degree to fear it. Build a public ritual of punishment loud enough, and you don't need legal literacy to learn the rules. That's why the Middle Ages are not simply less literate. They are more ritualized. They are more performative. They turn morality into a public theater where everyone knows their role. The preacher speaks, the crowd watches, the sinner is displayed, the community is purified. Which brings us back to our big question. Who profits when the future feels cancelled? In a visual age, the answer becomes sharper. The people who profit are the ones who can control the stage, who can decide which images dominate, which stories repeat, which emotions are rewarded. In the medieval world, that stage was often the church and the square. In the modern world, it's the platform and the feed. And what do stages naturally produce? Spectacle. Spectacle is cheaper than reform. Spectacle creates the feeling of action without the burden of solutions. Spectacle gives the crowd something to do with their anxiety. Cheer, jeer, share, condemn. Spectacle turns fear into participation. This is why visual dominance tends to bring back older social technologies: shaming, scapegoating, and mob judgment. Not because history repeats by magic, but because when attention becomes the currency, punishment becomes content, and content needs a face. So medieval people surrounded themselves with images that taught them who belonged and who didn't, who was holy and who was damned, who was protected and who was exposed. And they developed a visual vocabulary that could carry meaning without words, sometimes even jokes, absurdities, and subversive commentary hidden in the margins of manuscripts, which is exactly where we go next. Because the medieval image world didn't only preach, it also memed. It produced a strange, hilarious, unsettling visual language. Illuminated manuscript marginalia, beasts and grotesques, knights fighting snails, and one recurring figure that matters more than it should: the wild man, the furry boundary creature who embodied the fear that civilization itself might slip. So here's the open loop. When a society's truth travels primarily through images, what happens when those images stop being just decoration and start becoming weapons that organize fear? If you want proof that medieval people weren't living in a permanent fog of solemnity, look in the margins. Not the margins of society, the margins of books. Illuminated manuscripts weren't just texts, they were stages. Alongside sacred words, you find a second world drawn in the white space. Rabbits hunting men, monks riding snails, grotesque hybrids playing instruments, tiny wars between animals that never existed. To a modern eye, it looks like nonsense. But that's the point. It's a visual language that communicates mood, satire, anxiety, and insider jokes without needing a single sentence. A meme before the meme. This matters because it reveals something the tidy story of medieval ignorance tries to hide. Medieval culture was capable of layered meaning. It could hold reverence and mockery in the same frame. It could build a cathedral and still draw something obscene in the corner of a prayer book. That tension isn't a flaw, it's a survival mechanism. When the official world tells you history is ending, people find other ways to breathe. And in an age where most people can't access long-form texts, images become the fastest carrier of shared feeling. A single figure can compress a whole political emotion into one glance. That's why medieval visual culture produced archetypes that behaved like living concepts. Saints, devils, monsters, fools, roles that could be recognized instantly and deployed anywhere. One of the strangest, most persistent of these is the wild man. He appears in drawings and carvings, even on church walls. A furry humanoid, half human, half beast, living at the edge of the village, lurking in forests, sometimes snatching people, sometimes simply existing as a warning. He isn't one specific character, he's a category, a boundary creature. The embodied question, what happens when civilization stops holding? And you can feel why he grows popular in medieval Europe. Because the medieval world is a world that repeatedly experiences breakdown as a lived possibility, not as a hypothetical future, but as a recurring season, famine, war, banditry, displacement. The village is not just a place you live, it's a fragile line you defend, against hunger, against raiders, against the forest, against the animal world, against the unknown. The wild man is what the village imagines is waiting beyond the line. But he's more than a scary story. He's a moral diagram. Half human, half beast. He suggests that civilization is not permanent achievement. It's a costume the human animal wears, and under pressure, the costume can tear. This is why the wild man hits harder than a dragon. Dragons are external, wild men are you. He is the fear that the civilized self is thin, that the social order is an agreement maintained by scarcity, and that when scarcity wins, we revert. Now place this next to the Black Death, the catastrophe the competitor script points to as the perfect example of medieval, it's all falling apart. When plague sweeps across Europe in the mid-14th century, it doesn't just kill bodies, it kills assumptions. That God protects the righteous, that communities are stable, that institutions know what they're doing, that the future is predictable. It is a mass lesson in vulnerability, and vulnerability is fertile ground for visual politics. When people feel exposed, they crave categories: pure, soit impure, safe, dangerous, us, them. They crave simple explanations for complex terror. They crave visible signs of control. So the culture produces images that help people name what they can't control. Monsters, demons, the dance of death, the grotesque. Art that doesn't pretend everything is fine, but gives fear a shape so you can point at it. The wild man becomes one of those shapes, the nightmare that civilization can dissolve, and the animal inside will walk the streets. This is the part where modern parallels become less cute metaphor and more warning label. We also live in an age of high anxiety, and we also compress that anxiety into images. The doomer face, the wojak, the meme that carries an entire worldview in a single expression. You don't need a manifesto, you need a template, and templates have power, because templates allow mass synchronization of emotion. They allow millions of people to feel the same thing at the same time with almost no explanation. That is social glue, but it is also social fuel. It can become belonging, or it can become a hunting signal, which is why we can't stop at memes are funny. Medieval marginalia wasn't always innocent. Visual shorthand can smuggle cruelty. It can turn targets into cartoons. It can teach you who deserves mockery before you ever hear their side. So here's the pivot. If images can compress fear into a symbol, the next step is predictable. Power will learn to use that symbol. Communities will learn to rally around it. And when fear needs an outlet, the symbol will attach to a person. That's when the wild man stops being a story at the edge of the forest and becomes an accusation in the center of the town. Because in a society trained to believe collapse is moral, someone must always be chosen as the proof. Someone must be shown. And showing is always a form of violence. So here's the open loop. When a culture turns fear into symbols, how quickly do symbols turn into public punishments? And who gets selected as the sacrifice that makes everyone else feel safe? This is where you meet rough music, Charivari. The name is almost polite. The practice isn't. People gathered outside a target's home with pots, pans, bells, noise as a weapon. A mock serenade that was really an assault on reputation. Sometimes the target was accused of sexual misconduct, domestic impropriety, marriage violations, betrayal of communal expectations. Sometimes it was used to correct behavior. Sometimes, more rarely, it could celebrate. But its core logic was consistent. The community announces, loudly, that you have fallen out of favor. No trial required, no judge, just the sound of your social death arriving at your door. Charivari is not random cruelty. It's a governance tool. In a world where paperwork is expensive and authority is fragmented, it externalizes discipline. It makes punishment a group activity, and group activities create complicity. Everyone participates, everyone feels righteous, and everyone learns the lesson. Your life is not fully private. Your body and your reputation belong in part to the community's moral economy. That phrase, moral economy, is the key. Medieval public punishment isn't just about crime. It's about control of expectations. What behavior threatens the cohesion of a village? What behavior threatens hierarchy? What behavior offends the shared story that keeps people obedient under scarcity? When survival is fragile, conformity becomes sacred. So the system develops devices that punish without needing resources. The stocks, the pillory, the cage, the platform, wooden contraptions that lock you in place in the middle of town. You are not hidden in a prison where punishment is private and boring. You are displayed where punishment can be consumed. This is why public shaming is so persistent across pre-modern societies. It's cheap and it scales. A prison requires guards, food, infrastructure, paperwork, ongoing cost. A public humiliation requires a wooden frame and an audience. The crowd provides the labor, jeering, spitting, throwing whatever is within reach. The community becomes the runtime environment of the punishment. And the punishment is not only physical, it's symbolic. The point is to rewrite your identity in front of witnesses. Not, this person did a thing, but this person is the kind of person we do not tolerate. That is more efficient than confinement because it produces fear that outlives the moment. People remember the spectacle. They remember the laughter. They remember how quickly the crowd turned. The medieval square teaches a lesson. The modern world pretends it outgrew. Reputation is a social currency, and destroying it is a form of violence. Now zoom in on the legal side. Medieval justice was not simply a chaotic mob. There were courts, procedures, records, and civic regulations. But the power of public shame is that it can exist alongside law and also bypass it. It fills the gaps where institutions are absent, or where communities want faster justice than formal systems provide. And here's the part that stings. Even when official punishments were ordered by authorities, they were designed to weaponize the public. Authorities didn't just punish the offender, they trained the crowd. They turned spectators into participants, and participation into loyalty. When you throw the rotten fruit, you don't just express anger, you prove you are on the right side. You purchase safety with performance. That's why shaming rituals are contagious. They offer a bargain. Join the crowd, or risk becoming the next person in the frame. The competitor script compares this to modern cancel culture, and you can argue the label all day. But the structural similarity is hard to miss. A public display, amplified by a platform where community outrage becomes punishment. The point is not whether the target deserves it in any given case. The point is the mechanism. Justice reverting, sometimes, into social spectacle. Because formal institutions feel too slow, too distant, too compromised to satisfy the public appetite for moral resolution. In medieval towns, the square is the feed. In our world, the feed is the square. And the crowd learns the same instincts. Reduce the person into a symbol. Compress their identity into a single image or phrase. Demand an apology, not to learn truth, but to complete the ritual. Once the ritual is completed, the crowd feels purified, even if nothing actually improved. This is why I keep returning to our big question. When the future feels cancelled, societies don't become calm. They become hungry for control. If you can't buy prosperity, you buy certainty. And the cheapest form of certainty is a public enemy. Because public enemies unify. They simplify. They let everyone else feel normal. That is the psychological engine of medieval shaming. It turns anxiety into choreography. It gives fear a target and makes participation feel moral. And because it's cheap, it becomes tempting, even addictive. But we're not done, because shame is only one half of the medieval information system. The other half is rumour. In a world where print is rare and literacy is uneven, truth doesn't travel like a document. It travels like smoke, oral, fluid, shaped by emotion, carried by whoever benefits from the story. And once rumour becomes the currency of reality, it doesn't just shame people, it kills them. So here's the open loop. If a crowd can be trained to punish through spectacle, what happens when the crowd is trained to believe a rumour, and the rumour needs a scapegoat to feel like truth? Before the printing press, information didn't behave like a document. It behaved like weather. Oral, fluid, communal. It travelled through taverns, church doors, marketplaces, through whoever had the loudest voice, the strongest status, or the best story. And when truth moves like that, the centre of gravity shifts. The question stops being, what is proven? It becomes, what is believed? In the modern West, we were trained, briefly, to treat printed facts as normal. Newspapers, textbooks, encyclopedias, stable institutions that could be cited and checked. But that era, roughly the long age of print, was, historically, strange. A narrow window where information had friction, where lies were more expensive to distribute, where truth could pretend it lived in a single shared public record. The medieval world was not like that. In the medieval world, truth was often local. It belonged to your village, your priest, your lord, your guild, your neighbours. What mattered wasn't only what happened, but what your community agreed had happened. And once reality becomes a community agreement, it becomes vulnerable to the oldest political weapon on earth, the accusation. Here is what rumour does in a fragile society. It doesn't just misinform, it solves anxiety. When the world feels unstable, famine, plague, raids, economic stress, people crave an explanation that turns chaos into intention. Rumour offers intention. Rumour offers a villain. Rumour offers the emotional relief of a clean narrative. This happened because someone did something. And once that relief is available, evidence becomes optional. The Middle Ages give us a brutally clear case study, the story of William of Norwich. In 1144, a boy named William was found dead near Norwich. Instead of a cautious investigation, a story formed. The local Jewish community had killed him in a ritual act: torture, crucifixion, martyrdom. It was not merely a rumour that drifted away, it hardened into a cult. William became a saint-like figure in local devotion. The accusation became a social asset. It gave the community a moral drama, a holy victim, and a convenient enemy. That is what misinformation looks like when it finds a society prepared to believe it. It doesn't stay as a claim. It becomes a structure. It becomes a calendar of commemorations, a language of purity, a justification for exclusion, violence, and later repetition. Blood libel is not one lie. It is a reusable format, an accusation template that can be deployed whenever fear needs a target. And now we have to be confrontational about the lesson. The horror isn't only that people believed something false. The horror is that believing it felt useful. It simplified a world that wouldn't hold still. It made grief legible. It transformed uncertainty into moral certainty. It gave people a way to perform righteousness without fixing the conditions that produced their fear. Now drag that mechanism into the present, because the competitor script isn't doing a cute analogy here. It's pointing at a structural rhyme. And the rhyme gets uglier when you remember that our oral culture didn't disappear. It got digitized. Social media did not create rumor. It removed the cost of rumor. It gave rumor a megaphone, metrics, and an incentive system that rewards whatever keeps people staring, especially anger, disgust, and panic. The feed doesn't ask, "Is this true?" The feed asks, "Will this spread?" And you already know what spreads. Threats, scandals, outrage, accusations. Myanmar is one of the clearest modern examples of what happens when a society's public sphere is funneled through a single platform, and that platform is optimized for engagement rather than truth. For many people, the internet effectively arrived as a feed, fast, emotional, and difficult to verify. In that environment, hate speech and rumor can become a mass reality. The structure is medieval. Information is communal, fluid, and shaped by local trust networks. But the speed is new. The scale is new. And then comes the most medieval twist of all. Power learns to ride the rumor instead of resisting it. Reports and investigations have described how propaganda campaigns used fake accounts and coordinated messaging to flood the public space. Rumors, some tied to alleged assaults, some painting an entire minority as predators or invaders, did not stay as opinions. They became justification. They became permission. And the outcome was not an argument, it was violence, mass displacement, and thousands dead in the broader crisis. This is the point where neo-medieval stops being a metaphor and becomes a diagnosis. When truth is produced by the crowd, and the crowd's emotions are steerable, reality becomes a battlefield. Not a battlefield of ideas, a battlefield of loyalty. A battlefield where the question is not what happened, but who are you with? And once loyalty becomes the filter for truth, the old medieval toolset returns automatically. Scapegoats, public shaming, purity language, calls for punishment as proof of belonging. The community becomes the court, and the sentence is carried out by social consensus, sometimes digitally, sometimes physically, sometimes both. This is where we tie it back to our big question. Who profits when the future feels cancelled? Because when people stop believing in a future worth building, they look for safety in certainty. And rumor is a counterfeit certainty that costs almost nothing. It lets elites avoid responsibility by pointing downward. It lets platforms profit from engagement while claiming neutrality. It lets communities feel righteous while doing violence. And it sets the stage for the next escalation. Because rumor doesn't only create victims, it creates demand. Demand for protection. Demand for enforcement. Demand for someone who can restore order quickly. Outside slow institutions, outside law, outside accountability, which is exactly where the medieval world goes next. When fear and rumor dominate, people start hiring violence. They start outsourcing force. They start treating war and security as a service you can buy. So here's the plot turn. Once truth becomes a crowd product, the next commodity is obvious. If belief can be manufactured, then so can enemies. And when enemies are everywhere, someone will offer to handle them for a price. When institutions are weak and fear is loud, order becomes a market. That's not a metaphor. It's a historical pattern. In the modern world, we've been taught to imagine war as something only states do. flags, borders, declarations, uniforms, a monopoly on violence enforced by law. For the last few centuries, that monopoly has been one of the core myths of modernity, the idea that the state alone is allowed to wage war, punish, and kill in the name of the public. But the medieval world was never that neat. Power was fragmented, loyalty was layered, and violence was often something you could hire. The competitor script points to the free companies used during the long, grinding conflicts of late medieval Europe, including the 100 Years' War. These were mercenary bands, mobile pools of professional fighters who didn't necessarily belong to the place they fought for. They followed pay, they followed contracts, they followed opportunity. And when a truce arrived, these men didn't dissolve into peaceful citizens. They remained armed labor in search of wages. So they found wages in the most medieval way possible. They raided. Imagine the logistical absurdity from the perspective of a medieval ruler. You fund a force of hardened professionals. They do their job. Then peace breaks out, temporarily. And the very people you paid to impose your will become a threat to the countryside you claim to govern. Suddenly, you have a group of bored, disciplined killers living off the land, extracting taxes in the form of theft, violence, and protection rackets. It's not chaos, it's economics. They are soldiers without salaries. So they turn war into a business model. They sell protection, they sell fear, they sell the promise that they won't be the ones to burn your village, if you pay them first. This is what happens when violence becomes labor, and labor loses a stable employer. A famous individual case from the 14th century is John Hawkwood, an English mercenary leader who made a career in Italy as a condottiere, fighting for whoever offered the best deal, changing sides when the math changed. Medieval warfare wasn't always about national loyalty. It was about contracts and leverage. Now, stop and ask what that does to political psychology. If violence can be bought, then security stops being a right and becomes a privilege. The wealthy can afford guards, fortified houses, bribes, safe travel, and evacuation. The poor become the terrain on which the market of violence operates. The poor can't pay to be protected, so they pay by being exposed. That is the medieval ledger again. The costs flow downward. And this is where the neo-medieval diagnosis becomes uncomfortable in the present. Because the idea that war has returned to the marketplace is not speculative. It's already on the books. The modern era has seen the rise of private military contractors, companies that provide armed services in conflicts, sometimes alongside states, sometimes in the grey zone where states want plausible deniability. The competitor script mentions Blackwater during the War on Terror. A stark reminder is the 2007 Nisour Square incident in Baghdad, where Blackwater contractors shot civilians, an event that became emblematic of the accountability problems that arise when armed force exists in a semi-private category. Then there are groups like Wagner, operating across conflicts with shifting relationships to formal state structures, functioning as a tool of influence, resource extraction, and war fighting. Different context, different branding, same medieval logic. Violence as a portable service. And once violence becomes portable, it becomes slippery. It moves around the boundaries of law, the way medieval mercenaries moved around the boundaries of sovereignty. Who prosecutes? Whose rules apply? Whose courts have jurisdiction? If a soldier is not quite a soldier and not quite a civilian, accountability becomes a fog, useful fog. Fog is valuable because it is political cover. It allows leaders to say, "We didn't do it," while benefiting from the outcome. It allows corporations to claim, "We're only providing services," while shaping realities on the ground. It allows atrocities to become bureaucratically blurry, which is the easiest kind of atrocity to repeat. And now add the psychological impact on the public. When people sense that official institutions can't protect them, or won't, demand for alternative protectors rises. That demand can take the form of private security, armed contractors, militias, or informal strongmen. It is, again, a medieval reflex. If the king cannot guarantee safety, you find a local lord who can. The competitor script calls this techno-feudalism, and whether you like the label or not, the pattern is clear. Protection becomes privatized, and loyalty follows protection. People don't align with institutions that feel abstract. They align with whoever can keep them safe, feed them information, and punish their enemies. Which brings us to the final escalation. The medieval world wasn't only defined by mercenaries, it was defined by overlapping masters, multiple authorities claiming you, sometimes at the same time. A king, a church, a guild, a city, a lord. A web of obligations where rules conflict, and the most powerful actors pick the rules that benefit them. Our modern world is drifting back toward that web, not because we're wearing armor, but because sovereignty is being eaten from multiple directions. And private actors are starting to make decisions that look disturbingly like state decisions. So here's the plot turn. If violence can be outsourced and accountability can be blurred, then sovereignty itself becomes unnegotiable, not a principle, a product. And once sovereignty becomes a product, you can serve 5 masters at once, and none of them will admit they're responsible when you get crushed. The Middle Ages were not defined by castles. They were defined by layers. Layers of authority stacked on the same person until who rules you stopped having a single answer. In much of medieval Europe, you could owe loyalty to a king, obedience to the church, dues to a local lord, obligations to a guild, taxes to a city, sometimes all at once. Rules overlapped, competed, ignored each other, and conflicted. And in that conflict, power didn't disappear. It multiplied. Because when authority is fragmented, the strongest actors don't have to win an argument. They just pick the jurisdiction that favors them. They choose the rulebook that pays. For a while, the modern world tried to end that. The myth, because it's partly a myth, was Westphalia, a map where borders harden, sovereignty becomes singular, and the state monopolizes violence and law inside its lines. One territory, one law, one ultimate referee. Even when it didn't work perfectly, it offered something crucial, a place to point your anger. If the state fails, you know where to blame. But look at the world we actually live in now. Your data might be stored under one country's laws, processed by a company under another, carried across cables owned by a third, protected or exposed by standards you never voted on. Your phone changes because an external regulator sets a common charger rule. Your supply chain is global. Your labor market is international. Your information space is transnational. The lines on the map still exist, but they don't tell you who truly governs the systems you depend on. That is medieval again, not aesthetically, but structurally. And here's the more unsettling turn. Modern overlapping authority isn't just the return of old institutions. It's the rise of private actors making decisions that look like sovereign decisions. When a private company controls a communications network that can affect a battlefield, and a single executive decision can shape what is possible in a war zone, you've crossed a threshold. The competitor script points to the Starlink controversy around Crimea as a symbol of this. A private actor deciding whether a capability is available. You don't have to take a position on the politics to see the structure. The structure is simple. Sovereign power is leaking into spaces that don't carry sovereign accountability. And once accountability leaks, the moral ledger becomes hard to audit. When things go wrong, each authority can point to the other. The state blames the platform blames user behavior. The contractor blames the client. The regulator blames the market blames human nature. Everyone has reasons. No one has responsibility. This is what Hedley Bull was warning about when he described a kind of neo-medieval order. Multiple loyalties, overlapping authorities, and a world where people increasingly look away from the state for services the state used to guarantee security, meaning, belonging. You might rely on the state for roads, but on corporations for communication, on private systems for payment, on online communities for identity and moral guidance. The medieval pattern returns. You serve many masters, and none of them will fully protect you. Now we can finally answer the big question we posed in Act 1. When a society becomes convinced the future is already cancelled, who profits and who pays? The answer is not one villain. It's a mechanism. When the future feels cancelled, prosperity becomes harder to promise. So power shifts from building to managing, from creating material improvement to managing perception, fear, and loyalty. In that environment, the cheapest and most effective tools are medieval tools: spectacle, moral theatre, public shaming, rumour, scapegoating, outsourced violence, and overlapping authority that dissolves blame. Who profits? Those who can control the stage. Gatekeepers who ration legitimacy. Platforms that monetize outrage. Private security industries that sell protection. Political actors who can redirect anxiety toward enemies. Institutions that survive by offering certainty instead of solutions. In a world where hope is scarce, certainty is a product, and fear is the advertising. Who pays? The people whose lives become the raw material of order, the ones exposed to rumor and made into targets, the ones disciplined through public shame, the ones living inside systems they can't vote on and can't exit, the ones who carry the costs of fragmentation, confusion, precarity, and a permanent sense that rules exist, but never for the people who write them. That is why neo-medieval is not just a cute comparison, it's a warning about responsibility. The true horror of the Middle Ages, at their worst moments, wasn't mud or ignorance. It was how easily suffering could be moralized, how cheaply violence could be hired, and how effortlessly blame could vanish into overlapping systems. And here is the one thing medieval people couldn't see clearly while living inside their own anxiety. The end was not guaranteed. They thought judgment was imminent. In reality, transformation was approaching. The Renaissance didn't arrive because history is kind. It arrived because incentives shifted, institutions changed, and people rebuilt confidence in the future. slowly, unevenly, violently, but decisively. So the final question isn't whether we are already in the new Middle Ages. The final question is whether we are building a society where the Middle Ages can last forever, a permanent transition, endless spectacle, endless accusation, endless outsourced force and responsibility nowhere to be found. Or whether we're willing to do the harder thing, make the future imaginable again, so we don't have to buy certainty with someone else's life.